left off reading about our 4 constant archetypes. And then, let's see where I am. Oh, here we go. Living in the shadow. Although our archetypal patterns are essentially neutral, they do have both light and shadow aspects. The word shadow itself suggests a dark, ow, ow, that hurt. Get your paws out of my freaking skin. A dark, secretive, possibly malevolent countenance that looms in the background of our nature, ready to do harm to others as well as to ourselves. A much more appropriate understanding of the shadow aspects of our archetypes, however, is that they represent the part of our being that is least familiar to our conscious mind. Whether the shadow becomes our friend or enemy depends largely upon ourselves, wrote Marie-Louise von Franz, Jung's closest colleague and confidant. The shadow is not necessarily always an opponent. In fact, it is exactly like any human being with whom one has to get along, sometimes by giving in, sometimes by resisting, sometimes by giving love, whatever the situation requires. The shadow becomes hostile only when it is ignored and misunderstood. The Queen is among my own personal family of archetypes, for example, and it serves me quite well when I'm teaching a workshop. I have to be certain that everything I need so that I can work at my peak is ready when I need it, from my travel accommodations to the whiteboard I write on, even a cup of tea with honey to soothe my throat from all my talking. My Queen makes darn sure everything is just as it's supposed to be, or heads will roll. But at other times, when I least expect it, my Shadow Queen can make an appearance and start demanding things in an inappropriate way. Often, I'm not aware of my Queen's agenda until after she's come and gone. It remains in the shadow until I take a good look at whatever damage it may have done. Stop. I'll never forget the time I blew up at a couple of airline ticket agents because my flight had been delayed and I felt they weren't being straight with us passengers. As I stormed off in disgust, a young couple who had been waiting in line behind me caught my eye and came over. I thought they were going to thank me for speaking out, but instead the man said, "We just wanted to tell you how much we love your workshops." "Yes," the woman said, "we have all your books and tapes." I wanted to tell them that they'd just seen a textbook example of the Shadow Queen in action, but I was too humiliated to say anything. I just thanked them and kept on walking. It was about what I deserved for attacking a couple of airline employees who were probably just doing their job. The shadow aspects of our archetypes are fed by our paradoxical relationship to power. We are intimidated by being empowered as we are by being disempowered. The disempowerment is a threat to our well-being is easy to understand, at least at the surface level. But why should we also fear being empowered? That, in essence, is the paradox that feeds the shadow. The shadow can be seen as unexplored power. It expresses itself through behavior that often stop licking my foot. It expresses itself through behavior that often sabotages our express wishes and image of ourselves. These complex aspects of our personalities filter into our behavior by outwitting our conscious minds. Stop. After which they often assume a dominant role. We frequently don't know why we do the things we do, or why we have to cope with inexplicable fears. This leads to painful conflict when we feel one way and act another, separating the mind from the heart. Living with mind and heart divided is like having two battle encampments within, each one fighting for authority over our power of choice. When isolated from each other, the heart and mind are each handicapped. The mind tends to become hyper rational and the heart overly emotional. This imbalance of forces fragments our power, and like a nation in which opposing forces are constantly at war with each other, when our nature is fragmented, it is vulnerable to being dominated by fear. As Jesus said, if a kingdom is divided against itself, it cannot stand. Even when we know we are acting fearfully, we sometimes choose to be willfully ignorant about it. If I don't know why I am acting in a negative fashion, then it is easier to excuse my behavior or blame someone else. But if I am aware, both emotionally and intellectually, that I am harming another being, I not only have to hold myself accountable, I must also admit that I consciously chose to be negative. I can no longer hide behind the state of confusion created by the split between heart and mind. As long as your mind and heart lack a channel of clear communication, you will be confused about what to do with your life. Inevitably, as soon as you make contact with your life's passion, which can mean finding your vocation, your life partner, or even your sexual identity, you're going to experience a kind of spiritual suffering until you act on that passion. The suffering is actually a form of divine motivation, urging you to pursue a more authentic life. Awareness of a greater truth adds time pressure to your psyche and spirit, because the more you know, the faster you need to respond to that truth. I call this spiritual accountability. If you realize that negative judgments, including judging yourself, cause harm, then as soon as you realize that you are being judgmental, you also need to recognize when you are justifying yourself and your actions. Judging others and creating excuses while knowing better are only two of the spiritual challenges that will arise as you work with your survival archetypes. The more aware you are of the demands of managing your consciousness, the fewer hiding places will be available in your psyche and soul for the shadow play of the child, victim, prostitute, and saboteur. The relationship between awareness and responsibility also applies to your health. Once you become aware of how toxic anger or guilt is to your body and spirit, the consequences of these energy poisons become more pronounced than if you did not know better. If for no other reason than you now know their biological effects. This is negative visualization in action. The shadow and your divine potential. Jesus said to his disciples about his miraculous healing abilities, "All this shall you do and more of faith." The Buddha's enlightenment not only allowed him but to become omniscient as well. Yet he also told his followers that with diligence they too could achieve enlightenment, and he urged them to be lamps unto yourselves. These enlightened beings saw our highest potential as virtually unlimited. They were not necessarily referring to learning how to walk on water or effect miraculous cures, however, but to the fact that we can become as trusting of the divine as they. The Buddha, for example, insisted that his followers discover who they would be if they called their spirits back from attaching to the illusions of the external world. And Jesus said, "Unto you it is given to know the mystery of the kingdom of God." Do you bring in a lamp to put it under a bushel or a bed? Instead, don't you put it on its stand? For whatever is hidden is meant to be disclosed, and whatever is concealed is meant to be brought out into the open. To engage in the journey that takes us from living outside of ourselves to processing the world inside ourselves means bringing light to our shadow. Your shadow aspects are primarily rooted in fear patterns that have more control over your behavior, than does your conscious mind. This limits your ability to make choices in which you are aware of your motivations. Your shadow self includes emotional and psychological patterns that come from repressed feelings that you do not wish to deal with consciously for fear of the consequences. For example, rather than face the fact that your partner is in some kind of trouble or your child is using drugs, you may repress these strong, accurate instincts, possibly with disastrous results, and you may become short-tempered, angry, and depressed without realizing why. Your shadow also contains the secret reasons why you would sabotage the opportunities that come your way. People often tell me they have a fear of success. When I ask them to explain where that fear came from, many draw a blank. They have no idea why they have that fear. They just do. Having an unknown force controlling so much of the creative expression of our lives is a shadow. Eventually, we have to confront each of our shadow aspects. This exploration into our shadow is so complex that it may be one of the reasons why Eastern philosophy maintains that we need many lifetimes to achieve liberation. Your highest potential, then, is that part of you that is not limited in its expression by the fears of the physical world and the business of living. It is what you actualize when you are willing to confront your shadow, openly acknowledge the reality of its presence within you, and then take steps to deal with it. To rely on your inner resources and to follow your inner guidance before all else is to express your highest potential at all times. It shows you who you would be if you could live constantly within the knowledge that genuine power exists inside the self and never outside of it. Confronting your shadow requires that you strike out on your own. That isn't to say you can't receive help from friends, therapists, and wise counselors, but you will have to make choices that exclude the collective needs of your family, tribe, or group and separate yourself from them. If you do decide to follow an inner call and its unavoidable psychic ritual of separation, you have to withdraw your spirit from the magnetic field created by the collective power of your own energy, much as a mystic or seer might withdraw to hear divine promptings, like Jesus going into the desert or Muhammad to the cave of Mount Hira. This process of birthing your own power requires that you put yourself first, even though this may appear to the outside world to be selfish. During your separation, face the most narcissistic aspects of your ego, such as the shadow, who is concerned only with its own well-being and will try to scare you back into the fold. Your shadow victim, meanwhile, reveals its victimhood and will entice you to feel sorry for yourself for ever leaving. The shadow prostitute will urge you to sell out your integrity and your vision of true independence at the first opportunity. And the shadow saboteur will play to your suspicions that you aren't good enough to accomplish anything on your own. You will have to strengthen your soul identity until it is strong enough to eclipse all these fears. You are birthing your power of individual choice, increasing your potential for insight and for the opportunities serving your highest potential. In dealing with the shadows, you ready yourself to accept full responsibility for the management of your spirit and the consequences of your choices. Shadow contracts. I'm going to read some more of these. Shadow contracts. Just as your archetypes are neither good nor bad, so too your sacred contract is essentially a neutral force. One person's contract is not more important to the universe than any other's. Every contract is essentially the same in that it covers what each individual needs to learn in his lifetime. For that reason, we are put in places and in roles that best serve our contracts, whether that means we are born into royalty or poverty or somewhere in between. Whether you find yourself in a life filled with challenges such as serious illness, injury, or war, or whether your life is relatively free from trauma, you will have agreements to keep and a contract to fulfill. As the Tibetan Buddhist teacher Sogyal Rinpoche likes to say, there is poor people's suffering and rich people's suffering. Don't envy others because you can't know the extent of their suffering just by looking at their externals. Whatever your material lot in life, any external difficulties are vehicles for you to work on your internal challenges. On some level, it's obviously much easier to be rich than poor, but even the prosperous cannot sidestep their inner challenges or their appointment in samsara. Samara. In this regard, people often ask me if a contract can include an agreement to commit murder, rape, or other heinous crimes. Stop. You need to calm down. Hear me? Just relax. Could Hitler, Stalin, Mao, or Pol Pot have had contracts to murder millions of people? Questions about such enormous villainy are difficult to answer. But no, these criminals did not have a divine order to kill. It may be that some people have agreed to a life in which they encounter dark forces and have to choose how to deal with them. Will you stop? Get down if you can't control yourself. Get down if you can't control yourself. Get down. Thank you. You clearly can't control yourself. Let's see. As each of us is growing individually, we are also evolving collectively. Each of us has a dark side along with our own grace and light. The extent to which we can acknowledge the former while maximizing the latter may determine how we choose to fulfill the terms of our contract. When the shadow side takes over, even one person, the consequences are tragically felt by many. Even psychiatrists and brain scientists cannot offer a conclusive response to the question of whether individual people are born to murder. Social psychologist Stanley Milgram's groundbreaking book, Obedience to Authority, demonstrated that often it is not so much the kind of person a man is as the kind of situation in which he finds himself that determines how he will act. Milgram developed the controversial obedience experiments conducted at Yale University in 1961 and 1962, in which subjects were told by scientific authority figures to administer electric shocks to another person if he answered a question incorrectly, no matter how that person reacted. Milgram had expected that American subjects would not follow orders that seemed to hurt another person, especially if the person being shocked were screaming in obvious pain. Yet he found, surprisingly, that 65% of his subjects, ordinary residents of New Haven, were willing to give apparently harmful electric shocks up to 450 volts to a protesting and seemingly suffering victim. Of course, the shock machine was a sham and the subjects were not really hurting other people, who merely pretended to be in pain and even begged for mercy as stronger and stronger shocks were supposedly administered. Sadly, though, Milgram reported, with numbing regularity, good people were seen to knuckle under the demands of authority and perform actions that were callous and severe. In the aftermath of World War II, when people had assumed that Germans were more influenced by orders than other cultures, the obedience experiments were a cultural shock for Americans who prided themselves on being nonconformist. As Milgram said, it may be that we are puppets, puppets controlled by the strings of society. But at least we are puppets with perception, with awareness, and perhaps our is in the whole. Murder and torture occur because humanity as a group does not yet sufficiently value life in all its expressions. Perhaps that lack of sacred vision leads to the incarnating of bleak and brutal experiences. We all share a potential for becoming either the instigator or the victim of harm, whether physical or emotional. What we do to heal the victim and the aggressor within ourselves is the universal contribution we can each make towards healing the whole. And if we are ever to achieve our highest potential, we need to be, at the very least, puppets with awareness. People who committed heinous crimes, including mass murder, had the choice to act appropriately and morally, just as we all do. But they exercised their free will and chose wrongly, and heaped untold suffering onto others. Ultimately, I believe they themselves do suffer, whether in this life or the next or both. Perhaps these individuals have agreed to act as reflections of the darkest shadows of human nature. Although God has not assigned them to commit great evils, they may have been presented with a choice to act, and evil is one outcome of their choice. It is a basic spiritual impulse to try to find meaning even in tragedy, which awakens our need for greater action, justice, and protection of human rights. Uncivilized behavior, murder, and tyranny strengthen our belief in civilization, and democracy. Undisguised bigotry and hatred wake us to the need to practice love, compassion, and tolerance. It may seem facile to say that the Crusades, the Inquisition, slavery, the Holocaust, Stalin's purges, or the killing fields of the Khmer Rouge were meant to be learning experiences for the rest of us, especially when atrocities continue today under the guise of ethnic cleansing or the will of God. But I would argue that our awareness of the potential for escalating evil has led us globally to condemn and curb attempts at mass murder. Nonetheless, looking at the forces of fundamentalism, civil war, and corporate greed around the world, we may have even harder lessons to learn. This one is confronting the shadow. Let's see how long it is. Okay, I'm going to read Confronting the Shadow and then I'll stop there. Confronting the shadow. Learning to confront and ultimately manage your shadow, no matter how daunting it may appear, is an essential step on your road to spiritual maturity. Lucy's life is one illustration of how your world can change once you decide that you and not your shadow will create your future. Lucy spent years trying to please everyone but herself, which is hardly a rare dilemma. I had read a book a few years ago about a woman who decided one day just to pack up a few belongings and take to the road without a map or a personal agenda. Lucy told me she was just going to take her life one day at a time. I was filled with envy when I read that. Her story made me feel like a prisoner, and from that moment on, I was miserable. It wasn't my job, it wasn't my family, it was me, and my belief that everyone's happiness depended on my being in their lives. I encouraged their dependency. At the same time, I resented every one of them. Lucy realized that she was determined to control every person under her care because by keeping them dependent on her, she would not have to face her own weaknesses. She could tell herself that her family members were the children or victims and that she was in charge of the tribe. The anger that would erupt in her when their problems got to be too much was her inner self attempting to communicate to her that she was using her power to prevent people from taking charge of their own lives. Her fear of not being needed caused her to fear their independence, and yet their lack of independence caused her to resent their weakness. Stop. You stop. You don't need to growl. Nothing bad is happening. It's people walking past. Just stop. Okay? Just stop it. You don't have to have the last growl. Many people fear their own empowerment and unconsciously encourage their shadow to thrive. This happens in particular when conscious empowerment represents change, which can be terrifying. Change signals loss of control and entry into the unknown. But even beyond fear of change, empowerment represents isolation, which people will do anything to avoid. Perhaps this is the very core of our paradoxical view of empowerment. Our image of awakening to and fulfilling our divine potential evokes the idea of an individual who is whole and complete, separated from lesser mortals, isolated and alone. Culturally, we have yet to envision a realistic, appealing model of the spiritually empowered human being, someone who is simultaneously vulnerable, capable of sensual love, and worthy of a mate. We believe that enlightened people don't have the same needs or vulnerabilities that we do, or the same shadows. We also believe that enlightened people don't age, don't suffer, or mourn. I have seen the archetype of the whole, perfected human at work countless times in people. You would think that someone with her occupation would be above such emotions. People say when a spiritual role model is shown to have feet of clay, or you should see the way he lives, he's anything but celibate. We do not want to be whole if it means being alone, and we do not want enlightenment if it requires living as an aesthetic. So deep within our unconscious, we feed the energy of the saboteur, that part of ourselves that maintains our shadow pattern and fuels our fragmentation. We fear our own empowerment because it represents changes in our lives that would remove us from the warmth of those who love us for being vulnerable. And we fear being empowered because then we can no longer claim that we are not responsible for our actions. Although we want to be around a person who is enlightened or consciously working on becoming enlightened, we deeply fear the high price our own enlightenment will make us pay. Assuming personal responsibility for the quality not only of our actions, but also of our attitudes is a lifetime discipline. We cannot rest in the harbor of blame, so we unconsciously and sometimes consciously encourage our own weaknesses and hold on to our fears. As long as becoming enlightened represents isolation for us, we will shun our own empowerment. We fear to realize our highest potential, and this inevitably affects our creative, financial, and career potential. After you introduced me to this idea, a man named Maury told me, I started to look at each person in my life as representing some power in me that I needed to realize. This perspective was naturally far more useful when it came to dealing with those individuals with whom I knew I had a power struggle. But still, I became observant of exactly what made me feel powerless in certain relationships. And I would then study that feeling in me. I thought about how I would change were I to fill in the part of me with self-esteem, for instance. In each case, I could see immediately that my life would change dramatically with each choice I made to respond consciously to every interaction I had. In one case, I was with a friend who was celebrating his new membership into a very exclusive country club. I don't have the income required to belong to that place, and my first response was envy. I resented his being able to afford the type of life he has. But then I separated from him and turned the mirror onto me. I confronted the fact that he represented a kind of power that I had not developed. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that my resentment went beyond just that description. I had to admit that I resented the fact that he had the discipline to go the extra mile to mature that power in him. Whereas I was more inclined to look for reasons to knock off early from work, he saw everything as an opportunity and did all he could with his job. My resentment had nothing to do with money. It had to do with the manner in which he managed his potential. Once I admitted to that little insight, I knew that from that point on, I would have to take full responsibility for making lesser choices regarding my own opportunities in life. Because him and I were being handed the same chances. The only thing that was different between us was our response to these opportunities. Now I force myself to go that extra mile, but it's not easy. Every time I hang in there, I hear a voice telling me to find an excuse to take the easy road. Some part of me obviously does not want to grow up. And it's that part of me that waits until Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock to declare that the weekend has begun, just as I did when I was a kid. The symbol of the 3 o'clock school bell told me how deeply the child in me wants life to be a vacation. But I am understanding myself better each step of the way. I am recognizing my saboteur and my dependent child and other patterns that indicate that some part of me simply does not want to manage an empowered life. I also have to admit that I derive great inspiration from my country club friend because I now see him as representing my potential instead of the life I cannot have. He's simply a few opportunities ahead of me. Maury chose to respond to his feelings of envy about his country club friend by recognizing that they were the consequences of his own power deficits. He separated his shadow response from his feelings of friendship. He realized that he resented the power his friend had to maximize his potential and appreciate all the opportunities life had to offer. And he was finally able to unearth his deepest resentment, which was that his friend could handle rapid changes in life, whereas he needed to have things move slowly because he was so afraid of losing control. His friend had faith in the unknown, but for Maury, it was fraught with danger. Because Maury could analyze his shadow responses through his archetypical patterns, he was able to realize that his saboteur and child within were in fact extending him an invitation to realize his potential. On yet another level, Maury decided to work through an issue with his friend with whom he had a contract to support his own empowerment. Isn't that brilliant? So I'm going to read the archetype that we left off at. Oh, there's a rock right there. Isn't that cute? Engineer. There's a little rock. Engineer. I have to sneeze. Architect, builder, schemer. The engineer is eminently practical and hands-on and devoted to making things work. The characteristics of the engineer reflect the grounded, orderly, strategic qualities of mind that convert creative energy into practical expression. This archetype also manifests as a talent for engineering everyday situations or designing solutions to common dilemmas. The shadow engineers manifest as master manipulators. I know some Capricorns who have this quality. Designing and engineering situations to one's own advantage, regardless of the needs or desires of others. Films: Alec Guinness in The Bridge on the River Kwai, Gary Cooper in The Fountainhead, Jeff Bridges in Tucker. I was in that movie as an extra, me and my identical twin sister. Religion and myth: Ellen in Welsh Myth, the world's first highway engineer, who protected her land by magically creating highways so that her soldiers could defend it. Huh. Interesting. Amenhotep, ancient Egyptian architect who later was venerated as the god of building. Daedalus, renowned Cretan architect who constructed the labyrinth of the Minotaur and fashioned artificial wings for himself and his son Icarus. Huh. Interessante.